parietal bone, parietal bone, lacrimal bone, lacrimal bone, coronal suture, coronal suture, squamous suture, squamous suture, sphenoid bone, sphenoid bone, temporal bone, temporal bone, ethmoid bone, ethmoid bone, perpendicular plate of ethmoid bone, perpendicular plate of ethmoid bone, infraorbital foramen, infraorbital foramen, vomer bone, vomer bone, mandible, mandible, supraorbital foramen, supraorbital foramen, nasal bone, nasal bone, middle nasal concha, middle nasal concha, zygomatic bone, zygomatic bone, inferior nasal concha, inferior nasal concha, maxilla, maxilla, mental foramen, mental foramen, frontal bone, frontal bone, zygomatic process of temporal, zygomatic process of temporal, lambdoid suture, lambdoid suture, occipital bone, occipital bone, external acoustic meatus, external acoustic meatus, styloid process, styloid process, condylar process, condylar process, zygomatic process of temporal bone, zygomatic process of temporal bone, coronoid process, coronoid process, zygomatic bone, zygomatic bone, sphenoid bone, sphenoid bone, zygomatic arch, zygomatic arch, articular tubercle, articular tubercle, mandibular fossa, mandibular fossa, external acoustic meatus, external acoustic meatus, styloid process, styloid process, mastoid process, mastoid process, occipital condyle, occipital condyle, temporal bone, temporal bone, palatine process of maxilla, palatine process of maxilla, palatine bone, palatine bone, vomer bone, vomer bone, foramen magnum, foramen magnum, occipital bone, occipital bone, interior cranial fossa, interior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, celodersica, celodersica, cristogalli, cristogalli, cribriform plate, cribriform plate, ethmoid bone, ethmoid bone, frontal bone, frontal bone, lesser wing of sphenoid bone, lesser wing of sphenoid bone, petrosal part of temporal bone, petrosal part of temporal bone, parietal bone, parietal bone, posterior cranial fossa, posterior cranial fossa, frontal bone, frontal bone, sphenoidal fontanelle, sphenoidal fontanelle, sphenoid bone, sphenoid bone, nasal bone, nasal bone, zygomatic bone, zygomatic bone, maxilla, maxilla, mandible, mandible, interior fontanelle, interior fontanelle, parietal bone, parietal bone, coronal suture, coronal suture, posterior fontanelle, posterior fontanelle, occipital bone, occipital bone, mastoid fontanelle, mastoid fontanelle, temporal bone, temporal bone, sagittal suture, sagittal suture, lambdoid suture, lambdoid suture, frontal suture, frontal suture, frontal sinus, frontal sinus, ethmoid sinus, ethmoid sinus, sphenoidal sinus, sphenoidal sinus, maxillary sinus, maxillary sinus, mastoid air cells, mastoid air cells, right cerebral hemisphere, right cerebral hemisphere, left cerebral hemisphere, left cerebral hemisphere, gyrus, gyrus, sulcus, sulcus, precentral gyrus, precentral gyrus, central sulcus, central sulcus, post-central gyrus, post-central gyrus, longitudinal fissure, longitudinal fissure, olfactory bulb, olfactory bulb, olfactory tract, olfactory tract, optic nerve, temporal lobe, temporal lobe, pons, pons, myelencephalon, myelencephalon, cerebellum, cerebellum, frontal lobe, sulcus lateralis, sulcus lateralis, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, occipital lobe, short gyrus, lemon, lemon, insula, insular lobe, cingulate gyrus, fornix, septum pellucidum, interthalamic adhesion, interior commissure, pituitary gland, pons, cingulate sulcus, corpus callosum, parieto-occipital fissure, thalamus, habenular nucleus, pineal body, epithalamus, calcarine sulcus, posterior commissure, midbrain, hypothalamus, putamen, head of caudate nucleus, globus pallidus, thalamus, tail of caudate nucleus, amygdala, longitudinal fissure, cortex, caudate nucleus, substantia nigra, subthalamic nucleus, cerebral cortex, white matter of cerebrum, lateral ventricle, insula, hypothalamus, frontal cortex, fornix, mammillary body, hippocampus, cingulate gyrus, corpus callosum, thalamus, corpus callosum, interior commissure, hypothalamic sulcus, hypothalamus, pituitary gland, thalamus, habenular nucleus, pineal body, epithalamus, posterior commissure, pineal body, epithalamus, hypothalamus, subthalamus, mammillary bodies, brainstem, thalamus, infundibulum, pituitary gland, pineal gland, third ventricle, fixation point, suprachiasmatic nucleus, protectal nucleus, lateral geniculate body of thalamus, superior colliculus, optic nerve, optic chiasma, optic tract, uncrossed fiber, crossed fiber, optic radiation, occipital lobe, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, spinal cord, cerebrum, thalamus, hypothalamus, forebrain, hypophysis, cerebellum, optic chiasm, tuber cinereum, optic tract, cerebral peduncle, posterior perforated substance, lateral geniculate body, pons, middle cerebellar peduncle, olive, pyramid, ventral roots first spinal nerve, pyramidal decussation, infundibulum, mammillary body, temporal lobe, oculomotor nerve, trochlear nerve, trigeminal nerve, abducent nerve, facial nerve and intermediate ganglia, vestibulocochlear nerve, flocculus of cerebellar, glossopharyngeal nerve, vagus nerve, hypoglossal nerve, accessory nerve, third ventricle, pulvina, pineal body, superior colliculus, inferior colliculus, superior, middle, inferior, cerebellar peduncle, hypoglossal trigone, trigeminal tubercle, vagal trigone, obex, habenular trigone, lateral, medial, geniculate body, dorsal median sulcus, superior cerebellar peduncle, medial eminence, dentate nucleus of cerebellum, vestibular area, facial colliculus, tinea of fourth ventricle, cuneate tubercle, gracile tubercle, lateral funiculus, cuneate fasciculus, gracile fasciculus, medulla oblongata, superior cerebellar peduncle, middle cerebellar peduncle, inferior cerebellar peduncle, fourth ventricle, choroid plexus, interior lobe of cerebellum, cerebellar cortex, arborvita, posterior lobe of cerebellum, rostral lobe, caudal lobe, flocculonodular lobe, anterior cerebellar notch, central lobule, central lobule, culmen, culmen, declive, declive, folium, folium, superior vermis, superior vermis, quadrangular lobule, quadrangular lobule, primary fissure, primary fissure, horizontal fissure, horizontal fissure, simple lobule, simple lobule, postulate fissure, postulate fissure, rostral semilunar lobule, rostral semilunar lobule, inferior semilunar lobule, inferior semilunar lobule, posterior cerebellar notch, posterior cerebellar notch, lingula, lingula, superior medullary velum, superior medullary velum, flocculus, flocculus, fourth ventricle, fourth ventricle, inferior medullary velum, inferior medullary velum, nodule, nodule, uvula, uvula, pyramid, pyramid, tuber, tuber, inferior vermis, inferior vermis, ala of central lobule, ala of central lobule, superior, superior, middle, middle, inferior, inferior, cerebellar peduncles, cerebellar peduncles, dorsolateral fissure, dorsolateral fissure, retrotonsillar fissure, retrotonsillar fissure, tonsil, tonsil, biventer lobule, biventer lobule, secondary fissure, secondary fissure, caudal semilunar lobule, caudal semilunar lobule, interventricular foramen, interventricular foramen, cerebral aqueduct, cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle, central canal of spinal cord, central canal of spinal cord, lateral ventricle, third ventricle, right lateral ventricle, choroid plexus, left lateral ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle, choroid plexuses of third ventricle, interventricular foramen, third ventricle, blood-filled dural space, piamator, subarachnoid space, arachnoid, cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle, duramator, choroid plexuses of fourth ventricle, superior, corpus callosum, corona radiate, caudate, putamen, globus pallidus, basal nuclei, internal capsule, projection fibers, decussation of pyramids, longitudinal fissure, gray matter, white matter, lateral ventricle, fornix, thalamus, third ventricle, pons, medulla oblongata, corona radiator, insulla, lateral sulcus, central sulcus, superior longitudinal fasciculus, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe, frontal lobe, superior temporal gyrus, left hemisphere, left hemisphere, corpus callosum, corpus callosum, right hemisphere, right hemisphere, corpus callosum, corpus callosum, genu of corpus callosum, genu of corpus callosum, interior commissure, interior commissure, optic chiasma, optic chiasma, pituitary, pituitary, mammillary body, mammillary body, pons, pons, corpus callosum, corpus callosum, body of fornix, body of fornix, thalamus, thalamus, tubenular commissure, tubenular commissure, pineal body, pineal body, superior colliculus, superior colliculus, inferior colliculus, inferior colliculus, cerebral aqueduct, cerebral aqueduct, cavity of fourth ventricle, cavity of fourth ventricle, cerebellum, cerebellum, choroid plexus of fourth ventricle, choroid plexus of fourth ventricle, posterior commissure, posterior commissure, hypothalamus, hypothalamus, optic chiasm, optic chiasm, pars tuberalis, pars tuberalis, pars intermedia, pars intermedia, pars distalis, pars distalis, interior pituitary, interior pituitary, hypophyseal fossa encelador sicca of sphenoid bone, hypophyseal fossa encelador sicca of sphenoid bone, mammillary body, mammillary body, infundibular stalk, infundibular stalk, posterior pituitary, posterior pituitary, sphenoid bone, sphenoid bone, superior sagittal sinus, superior sagittal sinus, subdural space, subdural space, subarachnoid space, subarachnoid space, skin of scalp, skin of scalp, periosteum, periosteum, bone of skull, periostele, periostele, meningeal, meningeal, arachnoid mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater, pia mater, dura mater, dura mater, arachnoid villus, arachnoid villus, blood vessel, fox cerebri, fox cerebri, spinal cord, pia mater, dorsal root, ventral root, spinal nerve, dorsal branch, ventral branch, ramus communicans, dura mater, arachnoid, dorsal rootlets, ventral rootlets, spinal ganglion, periorbita, bulbar fascia, sheath of optic nerve, fat tissue, orbital septum, tarsal plate, trochlea, superior oblique muscle, levator palpebrae superioris muscle, superior rectus muscle, medial rectus muscle, lateral rectus muscle, inferior oblique muscle, optic nerve, inferior rectus muscle, auricle, malleus, incus, stapes, semicircular canal, vestibulocochlear nerve, oval window, cochlea, round window, auditory tube, auditory tube, pharynx, pharynx, tympanic cavity, tympanic cavity, tympanic membrane, tympanic membrane, external acoustic meatus, external acoustic meatus, superior nasal concha, superior nasal concha, middle nasal concha, middle nasal concha, inferior nasal concha, inferior nasal concha, nasal concha, nasal concha, frontal sinus, frontal sinus, sphenoethmoidal recess, sphenoethmoidal recess, superior meatus, superior meatus, middle meatus, middle meatus, inferior meatus, inferior meatus, hard palate, hard palate, soft palate, soft palate, tongue, tongue, hyoid bone, hyoid bone, larynx, larynx, trachea, trachea, esophagus, esophagus, pharyngeal tonsil, pharyngeal tonsil, palatine tonsil, palatine tonsil, oropharynx, oropharynx, lingual tonsil, lingual tonsil, epiglottis, epiglottis, greater horn, greater horn, corniculate cartilage, corniculate cartilage, arytenoid cartilage, arytenoid cartilage, epiglottis, epiglottis, body of hyoid bone, body of hyoid bone, thyroid cartilage, thyroid cartilage, vocal ligament, vocal ligament, epiglottis cartilage, epiglottis cartilage, hyoid bone, hyoid bone, cricoid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, trachea, trachea, superficial temporal artery, superficial temporal artery, posterior auricular artery, posterior auricular artery, occipital artery, occipital artery, basilar artery, basilar artery, internal jugular artery, internal jugular artery, carotid sinus, carotid sinus, vertebral artery, vertebral artery, thyrocervical trunk, thyrocervical trunk, axillary artery, axillary artery, subclavian artery, subclavian artery, middle meningeal artery, middle meningeal artery, maxillary artery, maxillary artery, inferior alveolar artery, inferior alveolar artery, external carotid artery, external carotid artery, facial artery, facial artery, lingual artery, lingual artery, superior thyroid artery, superior thyroid artery, common carotid artery, common carotid artery, brachiocephalic trunk, brachiocephalic trunk, venous sinuses, venous sinuses, vertebral vein, vertebral vein, right external jugular vein, right external jugular vein, right axillary vein, right axillary vein, superior ophthalmic vein, superior ophthalmic vein, cavernous sinus, cavernous sinus, pterygoid plexus, pterygoid plexus, interior facial vein, interior facial vein, internal jugular vein, internal jugular vein, right subclavian vein, right subclavian vein, right brachiocephalic vein, right brachiocephalic vein, interior cerebral artery, interior cerebral artery, interior communicating artery, interior communicating artery, internal carotid artery, internal carotid artery, superior cerebellar artery, superior cerebellar artery, interior inferior cerebellar artery, interior inferior cerebellar artery, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, posterior communicating artery, posterior communicating artery, posterior cerebral artery, posterior cerebral artery, basilar artery, basilar artery, vertebral arteries, vertebral arteries, interior spinal artery, interior spinal artery, spinal cord, interior cerebral artery, interior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, posterior cerebral artery, interior communicating artery, internal carotid artery, posterior communicating artery, basilar artery, vertebral artery, superior sagittal sinus, straight sinus, confluence of the sinuses, occipital sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, cavernous sinus, superior petrosal sinus, sigmoid sinus, transverse sinus, sagittal suture, coronal suture, squamous suture, orbit, nasal bone, maxilla, parietal bone, frontal bone, temporal bone, zygomatic arch, ramus of mandible, mandibular angle, mandible, sphenoid bone, zygomatic bone, maxillary teeth, lambdoid suture, occipital bone, temporomandibular joint, mastoid process, external occipital protuberance, nasal bone, maxillary sinus, mandibular condyle, external acoustic meatus, auricle, right cerebellar hemisphere, occipital bone, zygomatic bone, clivus, vertebral artery, medulla oblongata, mastoid air cell, left cerebellar hemisphere, nasal septum, zygomatic bone, right internal carotid artery, cranial nerve, mastoid air cell, right cerebellar hemisphere, maxillary sinus, left internal carotid artery, basilar artery, cochlea, pontocerebellar cistern, vermis of cerebellum, occipital bone, sphenoid sinus, right internal carotid artery, basilar artery, pons, transverse sinus, zygomatic bone, temporal lobe, left internal carotid artery, cranial nerve, fourth ventricle, left cerebellar hemisphere, eyeball, ethmoid ethmoid sinus, sphenoid sinus, sphenoid sinus, right internal carotid artery, right internal carotid artery, basilar artery, basilar artery, pons, pons, right cerebellar hemisphere, right cerebellar hemisphere, confluence of sinuses, confluence of sinuses, inferior rectus muscle, inferior rectus muscle, temporal lobe, left internal carotid artery, left internal carotid artery, trigeminal nerve, fourth ventricle, occipital lobe, eyeball, retroorbital fatty tissue, right internal carotid artery, pituitary gland, hippocampus, fourth ventricle, superior sagittal sinus, lateral rectus muscle, left internal carotid artery, temporal lobe, basilar artery tip, pons, cerebellar peduncle, cerebellum, occipital lobe, eyeball, optic nerve, optic foramen, right internal carotid artery, optic chiasm, posterior cerebral artery, midbrain, straight sinus, lambdoid suture, superior sagittal sinus, lens, medial rectus muscle, lateral rectus muscle, left internal carotid artery, dorsum sella, lateral ventricle, aqueduct of midbrain, cerebellum, occipital lobe, fox cerebri, eyeball, interior cerebral artery, optic tract, red nucleus, midbrain, quadrigeminal cistern, fox cerebri, superior sagittal sinus, lens, superior rectus muscle, middle cerebral artery, mammillary body, posterior cerebral artery, aqueduct of midbrain, lateral ventricle, optic radiation, eyeball, Sylvian fissure, insula, interior commissure, posterior commissure, superior cerebellar cistern, straight sinus, fox cerebri, superior sagittal sinus, superior rectus muscle, frontal lobe, interior cerebral artery, temporal lobe, third ventricle, thalamus, medial/lateral geniculate body, lateral ventricle, optic radiation, optic radiation, frontal bone, falx cerebri, internal capsule, external capsule, Sylvian fissure, lateral ventricle, thalamus, choroid plexus, superior sagittal sinus, frontal sinus, gray matter, white matter, frontal lobe, caudate nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus, internal capsule, corpus callosum splenium, inferior sagittal sinus, parietal bone, lambdoid suture, frontal bone, frontal lobe, head of caudate nucleus, thalamus, inferior sagittal sinus, falx cerebri, superior sagittal sinus, frontal sinus, corpus callosum genu, lateral ventricle, choroid plexus, corpus callosum splenium, longitudinal cerebral fissure, frontal lobe, corona radiator, outer table, diploe, inner table, superior sagittal sinus, lateral ventricle, precentral gyrus, central sulcus, postcentral gyrus, parietal lobe, parietal bone, superior sagittal sinus, frontal lobe, ethmoid cells, eyeball, nasal septum, nasal concha, frontal bone, falx cerebri, cristagalli, orbit, periorbit fat tissue, maxillary teeth, superior sagittal sinus, frontal lobe, optic nerve, medial rectus muscle, ethmoid cells, maxillary sinus, nasal concha, frontal bone, falx cerebri, superior rectus muscle, lateral rectus muscle, inferior rectus muscle, nasal septum, zygomatic bone, superior sagittal sinus, lateral ventricle, caudate nucleus, Sylvian fissure, middle cerebral artery, right internal carotid artery, pituitary gland, nasopharynx, ramus of mandible, tongue, corpus callosum, internal capsule, internal capsule, putamen, putamen, insula, insula, left internal carotid artery, left internal carotid artery, temporal lobe, temporal lobe, lateral pterygoid muscle, lateral pterygoid muscle, medial pterygoid muscle, medial pterygoid muscle, masseter muscle, masseter muscle, superior sagittal sinus, superior sagittal sinus, lateral ventricle, lateral ventricle, third ventricle, third ventricle, hippocampus, hippocampus, vertebral artery, vertebral artery, corpus callosum, corpus callosum, basal nuclei, basal nuclei, posterior cerebral artery, posterior cerebral artery, basilar artery, basilar artery, temporomandibular joint, temporomandibular joint, head of mandible, clivus, clivus, superior sagittal sinus, superior sagittal sinus, lateral ventricle, lateral ventricle, thalamus, thalamus, red nucleus, hippocampus, hippocampus, pons, pons, vertebral artery, vertebral artery, atlanto-occipital joint, atlanto-occipital joint, atlas, atlas, atlantoaxial joint, atlantoaxial joint, corpus callosum, corpus callosum, third ventricle, corticospinal tract, corticospinal tract, temporal lobe, cochlea, cochlea, parotid gland, odontoid process, axis, axis, superior sagittal sinus, lateral ventricle, thalamus, colliculus, aqueduct of midbrain, cerebellopeduncle, cerebellum, tonsil of cerebellum, CSF, choroid plexus, temporal lobe, tentorium cerebelli, fourth ventricle, mastoid air cell, spinal cord, superior sagittal sinus, straight sinus, cerebellar vermis, cerebellum, dentate nucleus, occipital bone, fox cerebri, lateral ventricle, tentorium cerebelli, transverse sinus, uvula of vermis, frontal lobe, Sylvian fissure, lateral sulcus, eyeball, temporomandibular joint, mandibular ramus, masseter muscle, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, mastoid air cell, external acoustic meatus, frontal bone, frontal lobe, frontal sinus, superior rectus muscle, optic nerve, eyeball, inferior rectus muscle, maxillary sinus, parietal bone, precentral gyrus, central sulcus, postcentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus, parietal lobe, insula, temporal lobe, transverse sinus, cerebellum, sigmoid sinus, posterior semicircular canal, coronal suture, frontal bone, corona radiator, frontal lobe, basal nuclei, frontal sinus, medial rectus muscle, sphenoid sinus, maxillary teeth, mandibular teeth, parietal bone, precentral gyrus, central sulcus, postcentral gyrus, parietal lobe, thalamus, lateral ventricle, lateral geniculate body, hippocampus, transverse sinus, cerebellum, coronal suture, frontal bone, corpus callosum body, interior commissure, corpus callosum genu, third ventricle, optic chiasm, basilar artery, frontal sinus, sphenoid sinus, pituitary gland, clivus, nasopharynx, hard palate, dens, tongue, oropharynx, third cervical spine, parietal bone, superior sagittal sinus, lateral ventricle, thalamus, corpus callosum splenium, posterior commissure, great cerebral vein, cerebral aqueduct, midbrain, cerebellar tentorium, pons, fourth ventricle, confluence of sinuses, external occipital protuberance, cerebellum, medulla oblongata, cerebellar tonsil, great cistern, atlas, spinal cord, axis, corpus callosum body, fornix, thalamus, interior commissure, mammillary body, optic chiasm, pituitary gland, sphenoid sinus, clivus, great cerebral vein, posterior commissure, cerebral aqueduct, pituitary stalk, fourth ventricle, great cistern, nasal bone, maxillary sinus, nasopharynx, vertebral artery, mastoid air cell, mastoid air cell, occipital bone, occipital bone, nasal cavity, nasal cavity, zygomatic bone, zygomatic bone, head of mandible, head of mandible, external auditory meatus, external auditory meatus, medulla oblongata, medulla oblongata, cerebellar hemisphere, cerebellar hemisphere, great cistern, great cistern, nasal bone, nasal bone, maxillary sinus, maxillary sinus, nasopharynx, nasopharynx, auricle, auricle, mastoid air cell, mastoid air cell, occipital bone, occipital bone, nasal cavity, nasal cavity, zygomatic bone, zygomatic bone, vertebral artery, vertebral artery, spinal cord, spinal cord, foramen magnum, foramen magnum, nasal bone, nasal bone, maxillary sinus, maxillary sinus, nasopharynx, nasopharynx, vertebral artery, vertebral artery, mastoid air cell, mastoid air cell, occipital bone, occipital bone, nasal cavity, nasal cavity, zygomatic bone, zygomatic bone, head of mandible, head of mandible, external auditory meatus, external auditory meatus, medulla oblongata, medulla oblongata, cerebellar hemisphere, cerebellar hemisphere, great cistern, great cistern, nasal bone, nasal bone, eyeball, eyeball, greater wing of sphenoid, greater wing of sphenoid, sphenoid sinus, sphenoid sinus, basilar artery, basilar artery, petrous part of temporal bone, petrous part of temporal bone, fourth ventricle, occipital bone, occipital bone, zygomatic bone, zygomatic bone, ethmoid cells, ethmoid cells, temporal lobe, pons, pons, temporal bone, mastoid air cell, mastoid air cell, cerebellar hemisphere, cerebellar hemisphere, eyeball, eyeball, retroorbital fatty tissue, retroorbital fatty tissue, greater wing of sphenoid, greater wing of sphenoid, pituitary gland, basilar artery, temporal lobe, fourth ventricle, mastoid air cell, transverse sinus, occipital bone, lens, zygomatic bone, optic nerve, anterior clinoid process, posterior clinoid process, pons, temporal bone, cerebellar hemisphere, eyeball, middle cerebral artery, basilar artery, temporal lobe, aqueduct of midbrain, occipital bone, frontal sinus, cristagalli, frontal lobe, interior communicating artery, temporal bone, posterior cerebral artery, midbrain, cerebellum, straight sinus, occipital lobe, vertebral artery, frontal bone, superior sagittal sinus, superior sagittal sinus, corpus callosum genu, corpus callosum genu, lateral ventricle, third ventricle, thalamus, great cerebral vein, straight sinus, occipital bone, frontal lobe, caudate nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus, pineal gland, choroid plexus, occipital lobe, frontal bone, superior sagittal sinus, lateral ventricle, thalamus, corpus callosum splenium, great cerebral vein, superior sagittal sinus, occipital bone, frontal lobe, corpus callosum genu, corona radiator, choroid plexus, straight sinus, occipital lobe, superior sagittal sinus, fox cerebri, white matter, superior sagittal sinus, frontal bone, parietal bone, frontal lobe, ethmoid sinus, periorbit fat tissue, maxillary sinus, superior sagittal sinus, fox cerebri, cristagalli, eyeball, nasal septum, nasal concha, superior sagittal sinus, gray matter, white matter, lateral ventricle, Sylvian fissure, temporal lobe, sphenoid sinus, sphenoid bone, nasopharynx, fox cerebri, corpus callosum, caudate nucleus, interior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, interior clinoid process, temporal bone, left internal carotid artery, ramus of mandible, superior sagittal sinus, great cerebral vein, cerebellum, mastoid air cell, occipital bone, parietal bone, fox cerebri, lateral ventricle, choroid plexus, temporal bone, tentorium cerebelli, fourth ventricle, foramen magnum, frontal bone, frontal lobe, eyeball, lens, retroorbital fatty tissue, sphenoid bone, maxillary sinus, parietal lobe, parietal lobe, insula, insula, temporal lobe, temporal lobe, transverse sinus, transverse sinus, cerebellum, cerebellum, occipital bone, occipital bone, corona radiator, corona radiator, frontal bone, frontal bone, frontal lobe, frontal lobe, basal nuclei, basal nuclei, sphenoid bone, sphenoid bone, ethmoid sinus, ethmoid sinus, sphenoid sinus, sphenoid sinus, maxillary sinus, maxillary sinus, parietal bone, parietal bone, parietal lobe, parietal lobe, lateral ventricle, lateral ventricle, choroid plexus, choroid plexus, thalamus, thalamus, temporal lobe, temporal lobe, cerebellum, cerebellum, occipital bone, occipital bone, frontal bone, frontal bone, corpus callosum body, corpus callosum body, lateral ventricle, lateral ventricle, thalamus, thalamus, third ventricle, pituitary gland, pituitary gland, ethmoid sinus, ethmoid sinus, sphenoid sinus, sphenoid sinus, clivus, clivus, nasopharynx, nasopharynx, parietal lobe, parietal lobe, cerebellar tentorium, cerebellar tentorium, midbrain, midbrain, pons, pons, fourth ventricle, cerebellum, cerebellum, occipital bone, occipital bone, medulla oblongata, medulla oblongata, cerebral vein, cerebral vein, superior sagittal sinus, superior sagittal sinus, interior cerebral artery, interior cerebral artery, basilar artery tip, basilar artery tip, basilar artery, basilar artery, vertebral artery, vertebral artery, inferior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, internal cerebral vein, internal cerebral vein, straight sinus, confluence of sinuses, confluence of sinuses, maxillary teeth, maxillary teeth, ramus of mandible, ramus of mandible, dens, dens, atlas, atlas, pharynx, pharynx, transverse foramen, transverse foramen, foramen magnum, foramen magnum, maxillary sinus, maxillary sinus, mastoid process, mastoid process, nasal septum, nasal septum, head of mandible, mastoid air cell, mastoid air cell, internal occipital protuberance, internal occipital protuberance, zygomatic bone, zygomatic bone, clivus, clivus, external auditory meatus, external auditory meatus, lambdoid suture, lambdoid suture, occipital bone, occipital bone, nasal bone, nasal bone, interior clinoid process, interior clinoid process, lambdoid suture, ethmoid sinus, ethmoid sinus, optic foramen, temporal bone, occipital bone, cristagalli, frontal sinus, coronal suture, frontal bone, parietal bone, frontal bone, nasal bone, maxillary teeth, frontal sinus, cristagalli, nasal septum, maxillary sinus, ethmoid sinus, zygomatic bone, zygomatic bone, nasal concha, parietal bone, anterior clinoid process, temporal bone, ramus of mandible, sphenoid sinus, sagittal suture, parietal bone, mandibular fossa, head of mandible, ramus of mandible, temporomandibular joint, clivus, ossicles, occipital condyle, atlas, axis, mastoid air cell, external auditory meatus, odontoid process, atlantoaxial joint, temporal bone, mastoid process, frontal bone, zygomatic bone, mandibular fossa, head of mandible, ramus of mandible, parietal bone, temporomandibular joint, occipital bone, external auditory meatus, mastoid air cell, mastoid process, coronal suture, orbit roof, sphenoid bone, maxillary sinus, maxillary teeth, frontal sinus, celodersica, sphenoid sinus, clivus, atlas, odontoid process, sphenoid sinus, internal auditory meatus, mastoid air cell, temporal bone, lambdoid suture, occipital bone, ossicles, cochlea, external auditory meatus, occipital condyle, atlas, axis, atlanto-occipital joint, odontoid process, atlantoaxial joint, maxillary teeth, nasopharynx, curved reformation line, maxillary sinus, mandible, temporomandibular joint, external auditory meatus, ramus of mandible, temporal lobe, mandible, submandibular gland, Warden's duct, clavicle, lung apex, sphenoid sinus, temporal bone, nasopharynx, tongue, laryngeal inlet, trachea, left brachiocephalic vein, temporal lobe, sphenoid bone, mandible, uvula, submandibular submandibular gland, cricoid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, right internal jugular vein, right internal jugular vein, right common carotid artery, right common carotid artery, lung apex, left internal carotid artery, left internal carotid artery, cavernous sinus, temporal bone, nasopharynx, zygomatic bone, soft palate, palatine tonsil, epiglottis, laryngeal inlet, thyroid cartilage, thyroid gland, trachea, left subclavian vein, temporal lobe, right internal carotid artery, parotid gland, right common carotid artery, right vertebral artery, superior vena cava, basilar artery, temporomandibular joint, atlas, atlantoaxial joint, vertebral body, cervical plexus, intervertebral disc, left common carotid artery, aortic arch, maxillary teeth, ramus of mandible, right internal carotid artery, right jugular vein, medulla oblongata, hard palate, soft palate, nasopharynx, parotid gland, atlantoaxial joint, left vertebral artery, atlas, thyroid cartilage lamina, right common carotid artery, right jugular vein, articular process, larynx, cricoid cartilage, left vertebral artery, spinal cord, lamina, spinous process, thyroid gland, right common carotid artery, right vertebral artery, trachea, esophagus, cervical vertebral body, spinal cord, lamina, spinous process, temporal lobe, sphenoidal sinus, pterygoid process, nasopharynx, mandible, submandibular gland, right carotid artery bifurcation, lung apex, temporal bone, zygomatic bone, soft palate, tongue, hyoid bone, trachea, left common carotid artery, ascending aorta, uvula, oropharynx, larynx, right jugular vein, superior vena cava, superior vena cava, mastoid air cell, mastoid air cell, thyroid gland, left jugular vein, brachiocephalic artery, aortic arch, sphenoidal sinus, nasopharynx, oropharynx, larynx, right common carotid artery, right jugular vein, trachea, superior vena cava, mastoid air cell, styloid process, mandible, left carotid artery bifurcation, left common carotid artery, left subclavian vein, aortic arch, ascending aorta, basilar artery, clivus, atlas, axis, vertebral body, right vertebral artery, lung apex, styloid process, left internal carotid artery, parotid gland, intervertebral disc, left subclavian artery, carina, celladersica, ethmoidal cell, sphenoid sinus, clivus, inferior nasal concha, nasopharynx, teeth, oropharynx, mandible, hyoid bone, larynx, trachea, sternum, aortic arch, pituitary gland, cerebellar tentorium, cerebellum, occipital bone, medulla oblongata, atlas, axis, epiglottis, spinal cord, intervertebral disc, spinous process, intervertebral foramen, eyeball, inferior rectus muscle, maxillary sinus, external carotid artery, submandibular gland, common carotid artery, pulmonary artery, internal occipital protuberance, external auditory canal, styloid process, internal carotid artery, carotid artery bifurcation, aortic arch, jugular vein, mastoid air cell, descending aorta, ramus of mandible, pharynx, right jugular vein, right vertebral artery, spinal cord, teeth, hard palate, soft palate, styloid process, styloid process, parotid gland, odontoid process, atlas, hyoid bone, mandible, tongue, submandibular gland, left external carotid artery, left internal carotid artery, left internal carotid artery, lamina, larynx, cricoid cartilage, thyroid cartilage, left common carotid artery, left vertebral artery, thyroid gland, right jugular vein, right common carotid artery, lamina, trachea, esophagus, left vertebral artery, spinal cord, spinous process, clavicle, brachiocephalic artery, lung apex, rib, scapula, left brachiocephalic vein, left common carotid artery, left subclavian artery, superior vena cava, tracheal bifurcation, costovertebral joint, costotransverse joint, manubrium of sternum, aortic arch, thoracic aorta, transverse process, interior cerebral artery, right internal carotid artery, right vertebral artery, right external carotid artery, right carotid artery bifurcation, right common carotid artery, right vertebral artery, right subclavian artery, brachiocephalic artery, ascending aorta, left middle cerebral artery, left internal carotid artery, left vertebral artery, left external carotid artery, left carotid artery bifurcation, left common carotid artery, left vertebral artery, left subclavian artery, aortic arch, descending aorta, internal carotid artery, maxillary artery, external carotid artery, facial artery, middle cerebral artery, posterior cerebral artery, basilar artery, vertebral artery, carotid artery bifurcation, interior cerebral artery, right internal carotid artery, right vertebral artery, right external carotid artery, right carotid artery bifurcation, right carotid artery bifurcation, right common carotid artery, right common carotid artery, right vertebral artery, right vertebral artery, right subclavian artery, right subclavian artery, brachiocephalic artery, brachiocephalic artery, ascending aorta, ascending aorta, left middle cerebral artery, left middle cerebral artery, basilar artery, basilar artery, left internal carotid artery, left internal carotid artery, left vertebral artery, left vertebral artery, left external carotid artery, left external carotid artery, left carotid artery bifurcation, left carotid artery bifurcation, left common carotid artery, left common carotid artery, left vertebral artery, left vertebral artery, left subclavian artery, left subclavian artery, aortic arch, aortic arch, descending aorta, descending aorta, internal carotid artery, internal carotid artery, maxillary artery, maxillary artery, external carotid artery, external carotid artery, facial artery, facial artery, middle cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, posterior cerebral artery, posterior cerebral artery, vertebral artery, vertebral artery, carotid artery bifurcation, carotid artery bifurcation, vertebral artery, vertebral artery, interior cerebral artery, interior cerebral artery, interior communicating artery, interior communicating artery, posterior cerebral artery, posterior cerebral artery, internal carotid artery, internal carotid artery, right vertebral artery, right vertebral artery, external carotid artery, external carotid artery, middle cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, basilar artery tip, basilar artery tip, basilar artery, basilar artery, left vertebral artery, left vertebral artery, maxillary artery, maxillary artery, vertebral artery, vertebral artery, temporal bone, temporal bone, interior cerebral artery, interior cerebral artery, interior communicating artery, interior communicating artery, posterior cerebral artery, posterior cerebral artery, internal carotid artery, internal carotid artery, right vertebral artery, right vertebral artery, external carotid artery, external carotid artery, middle cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, basilar artery tip, basilar artery tip, basilar artery, basilar artery, left vertebral artery, left vertebral artery, maxillary artery, maxillary artery, left vertebral artery, left vertebral artery, right internal jugular vein, right internal jugular vein, sigmoid sinus, sigmoid sinus, left internal carotid artery, left internal carotid artery, basilar artery, basilar artery, transverse sinus, transverse sinus, confluence of sinuses, confluence of sinuses, superior sagittal sinus, superior sagittal sinus, transverse sinus, transverse sinus, cerebral vein, cerebral vein, sigmoid sinus, sigmoid sinus, internal jugular vein, internal jugular vein, superior sagittal sinus, superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, internal cerebral vein, internal cerebral vein, straight sinus, basilar artery, basilar artery, confluence of sinuses, confluence of sinuses, superior sagittal sinus, superior sagittal sinus, cerebral vein, internal jugular vein, internal jugular vein, internal cerebral vein, internal cerebral vein, cerebellar tentorium, cerebellar tentorium, sigmoid sinus, sigmoid sinus, confluence of sinuses, confluence of sinuses, transverse sinus, transverse sinus, cerebral vein, cerebral vein, confluence of sinuses, confluence of sinuses, superior sagittal sinus, superior sagittal sinus, sigmoid sinus, sigmoid sinus, internal jugular vein, internal jugular vein, inferior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, internal cerebral vein, internal cerebral vein, basal vein, basal vein, cavernous sinus, cavernous sinus, transverse sinus, transverse sinus, internal cerebral vein, internal cerebral vein, straight sinus, straight sinus, interior cerebral artery, interior cerebral artery, cavernous portion of internal carotid artery, cavernous portion of internal carotid artery, middle cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, genu of middle cerebral artery, genu of middle cerebral artery, petrous portion of internal carotid artery, petrous portion of internal carotid artery, cervical portion of internal carotid artery, cervical portion of internal carotid artery, cerebral capillary, cerebral capillary, superior sagittal sinus, superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, right transverse sinus, right transverse sinus, right internal jugular vein, right internal jugular vein, superficial cortical veins, superficial cortical veins, internal cerebral veins, internal cerebral veins, confluence of sinuses, confluence of sinuses, sigmoid sinus, sigmoid sinus, interior cerebral artery, interior cerebral artery, ophthalmic artery, ophthalmic artery, cervical portion of internal carotid artery, cervical portion of internal carotid artery, middle cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, posterior communicating artery, posterior communicating artery, cavernous portion of internal carotid artery, cavernous portion of internal carotid artery, petrous portion of internal carotid artery, petrous portion of internal carotid artery, cerebral capillary, cerebral capillary, superficial cerebral veins, superficial cerebral veins, inferior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, cavernous sinus, cavernous sinus, superior sagittal sinus, superior sagittal sinus, vein of Trollard, vein of Trollard, great cerebral vein of Galen, great cerebral vein of Galen, confluence of venous sinuses, confluence of venous sinuses, transverse sinus, transverse sinus, sigmoid sinus, sigmoid sinus, internal jugular vein, internal jugular vein, basilar artery tip, basilar artery tip, basilar artery, basilar artery, posterior cerebral artery, posterior cerebral artery, superior cerebellar artery, superior cerebellar artery, interior inferior cerebellar artery, interior inferior cerebellar artery, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, vertebral artery exiting transverse foramen of atlas, vertebral artery exiting transverse foramen of atlas, cerebellum capillary, cerebellum capillary, straight sinus, confluence of sinuses, confluence of sinuses, right internal jugular vein, right internal jugular vein, left transverse sinus, left transverse sinus, sigmoid sinus, sigmoid sinus, basilar artery tip, basilar artery tip, posterior communicating artery, posterior communicating artery, basilar artery, basilar artery, posterior cerebral artery, posterior cerebral artery, superior cerebellar artery, superior cerebellar artery, interior inferior cerebellar artery, interior inferior cerebellar artery, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, vertebral artery exiting transverse foramen of atlas, vertebral artery exiting transverse foramen of atlas, cerebellum capillary, cerebellum capillary, great cerebral vein of Galen, great cerebral vein of Galen, straight sinus, transverse sinus, transverse sinus, confluence of venous sinuses, confluence of venous sinuses, internal jugular vein, internal jugular vein, sigmoid sinus, sigmoid sinus, frontal branch of superficial temporal artery, frontal branch of superficial temporal artery, superficial temporal artery, superficial temporal artery, middle meningeal artery, middle meningeal artery, maxillary artery, maxillary artery, deep temporal artery frontal branch of superficial, deep temporal artery frontal branch of superficial, temporal artery, temporal artery, facial artery parietal branch of superficial, facial artery parietal branch of superficial, temporal artery, temporal artery, middle temporal artery, middle temporal artery, middle meningeal artery, middle meningeal artery, deep temporal artery, deep temporal artery, occipital artery, occipital artery, sagittal suture, sagittal suture, lambdoidal suture, lambdoidal suture, cristagalli, cristagalli, orbit, orbit, maxilla, maxilla, mastoid air cell, mastoid air cell, atlantoaxial joint, atlantoaxial joint, teeth, teeth, frontal bone, petrous ridges, petrous ridges, sphenoid bone, sphenoid bone, zygomatic bone, zygomatic bone, nasal septum, odontoid process, odontoid process, ramus of mandible, ramus of mandible, 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 hornal suture, frontal sinus, interior clinoid process, interior clinoid process, sphenoidal sinus, temporomandibular joint, temporomandibular joint, maxillary sinus, hyoid bone, trachea, parietal bone, posterior clinoid process, celodersica, internal occipital protuberance, external auditory meatus, atlas, spinous process, esophagus, sagittal suture, hornal suture, lambdoidal suture, mastoid air cell, ethmoidal cell, mastoid process, parietal bone, occipital bone, frontal bone, petrous ridges, sphenoid bone, zygomatic bone, ramus of mandible, teeth, coronoid process of the mandible, coronoid process of the mandible, foramen magnum, foramen magnum, sphenoidal sinus, sphenoidal sinus, odontoid process, odontoid process, frontal sinus, frontal sinus, ethmoidal cell, ethmoidal cell, nasal septum, nasal septum, mastoid air cell, mastoid air cell, odontoid process, odontoid process, parietal bone, parietal bone, maxillary sinus, maxillary sinus, zygomatic bone, zygomatic bone, coronoid process of the mandible, coronoid process of the mandible, petrous ridges, petrous ridges, mandibular angle, mandibular angle, foramen magnum, foramen magnum, ethmoid sinus, ethmoid sinus, nasal bone, nasal bone, sphenoidal sinus, sphenoidal sinus, ramus of mandible, ramus of mandible, temporomandibular joint, temporomandibular joint, mandibular head, mandibular head, sphenoidal sinus, sphenoidal sinus, mastoid air cell, mastoid air cell, external auditory meatus, external auditory meatus, mastoid tip air cell, mastoid tip air cell, mastoid air cell, mastoid air cell, atlas, atlas, vertebral body, vertebral body, seventh cervical spine, seventh cervical spine, lung apex, mandibular angle, mandibular angle, trachea, trachea, spinous process, spinous process, first thoracic spine, first thoracic spine, aortic arch, aortic arch, sphenoidal sinus, sphenoidal sinus, nasopharynx, nasopharynx, oropharynx, oropharynx, epiglottis, epiglottis, larynx, larynx, celodersica, celodersica, internal occipital protuberance, internal occipital protuberance, external occipital protuberance, external occipital protuberance, axis, axis, esophagus, esophagus, skull bone, skull bone, cavum septi pellucidity, cavum septi pellucidity, lateral ventricle, lateral ventricle, thalamus, thalamus, lateral ventricle, lateral ventricle, choroid plexus, choroid plexus, cisterna magna, cisterna magna, cerebellum, cerebellum, placenta, placenta, forearm, forearm, amniotic fluid, amniotic fluid, head of fetus, fetal spine, fetal spine, fetal hand, fetal hand, fetal femur, fetal femur, fetal foot, sternocleidomastoid muscle, sternocleidomastoid muscle, strat muscle, common carotid artery, thyroid gland, thyroid isthmus, trachea, external carotid artery, internal carotid artery, carotid artery bifurcation,